The questions are absolutely vital in terms of their use in structuring the learning across the curriculum. So when we're thinking of planning across a sequence of lessons, good practice in recent years has really focused on enquiry questions as the bedrock, really, of that planning, because those questions give the learning focus across a sequence of learning. Just to try and express where you're going with these enquiries diagrammatically, what you've done, so if we just express one here, you've selected the content that you want to cover. So there's a focus in this first one on the medieval village. Okay? You are then thinking about the focus for that. In other words, what about a medieval village? And that's then going to lead to an enquiry question that at the moment you say you're not entirely happy with, and there may be some need for refinement of the question that's going to govern the sequence of learning. There's a possible tension here in this enquiry between two things, really, because I think one thing is really powerful. You're thinking in terms of medieval village. Well, what kind of aspects of historical thinking are we trying to develop through the sequence of lessons on the medieval village? And you seem to have settled on two. One is the features of a medieval village. You want children to understand some of the complexity of living in a medieval village. And the other one you've settled on is the development of their evidential understanding. You do want the children to understand that this was a long time ago, it was 600-700 years ago, and therefore it's more difficult to find out about the lives of ordinary people at that time than it is to find out about their lives in the 19th century. So I think that's useful, double focus, as it were, but that might raise some tensions in terms of defining the learning objectives and the pupils understanding where the focus is an individual. But we can discuss that as we move through, and it might be, for example, that we want to kind of keep one as an underlayer, as it were, and bring one into sharper focus. But we can discuss that as we go through, perhaps, and just where the real focus lies. So if we keep your manorial role play in mind, that this is where it's going in terms of the end product, and then the reflection on that. And where the historical rigour will come through in here is developing their understanding in these two dimensions. One of the diversity and complexity within a medieval village, and I think we probably, our starting point is to get our heads around, well, what do we want children to understand about life in a medieval village? What do they need to be communicating in their manorial role play, really? What needs to stick? What's the kind of residual knowledge that we'll expect them to have when we move on to look at kind of 19th century life or 20th century? So to get our heads around what actual knowledge and understanding we're after, and also then the other aspect of this, which is what dimensions of evidential understanding are we trying to develop through this inquiry as well.
That links really well with what Chris was saying to us about about the what's the residual, what's going to be left, and far more than the dates and did medieval people wear pants or whatever. But it's more the kind of that idea of similarity and difference and complexity, and also that idea of the complex society. You know what I mean? I think I think there's a lot of assumptions that when you look at a medieval village, well, it must have been simpler back then, and in some senses, perhaps in some senses, it was. But yet, in some sense, if they get to them, if they could nearly be seeing in their manorial court that it's a fairly complex society, then that's going to be an element that I don't think they'll maybe have heard before, or they'll be aware of. You know what I mean? That this medieval village has a lot of difference in it, rather than just this kind of
difference. You mean between different people? So we're not just talking about the medieval peasant.
No.
We're talking about different peasants. We're talking about free men. We're talking about villains. We're talking about free men of different wealth and so on. So that difference. Any other dimensions to medieval village life that you think are important to get across?
I think the idea of the structure of medieval life, because there's in the manorial court, for instance, that they have, pupils find that quite fascinating. But again, I would like them to be aware of that rather than it be a shock to them.
Yes.
When again of teacher intervention saying, "Oh well, you couldn't have voted at the time," type thing.
Yes.
So the structure of society, and maybe also the aspect of the kind of power, but and then also the link to religion in a sense. I mean, I think maybe that might help us for the Black Death slightly later on as well.
Yes. Any other things?
Maybe that issue of religion.
Of religion,
you know what I mean? And kind of, I mean, whether that's sort of associated with power, which it is, and even the structure of society. And the idea that, I mean, even maybe saving, because if we can at least plant that now, then the stuff, for instance, with Beckett and Henry at a macro level later will be much richer if we have that even at the village level. The priest was kind of important type thing. So
we need to be doing some knowledge planting on religion in this inquiry, because that's going to feed into another inquiry that comes later.
Because if ultimately what we're trying to do is get them to compare and contrast medieval life with their own life, what do we know about our own lives that we want them to draw similarities and differences between with a medieval life? I don't know. So anything from what would we say about our own lives that we want them to compare?
So an understanding of, for example, the context in which people lived their lives, the houses they lived in, and their food, and
or the kind of, we've all seen this done a million times. We've done it a million times as far as what was life like today? What was life like? I mean, because I think it's the same with the chronology sort of discussion that we're having. It's all dead easy to do a timeline, but a timeline is a load of nonsense. It's good for a quiz, but it's not good for anything else. You know what I mean? And it's there's a richness in this that will help us much later, and that's what that's what you would want from it.
If these are dimensions of medieval village life that we want pupils to bring into their final product, I mean, what do you think would be a useful focus? Because if we return to this possible tension again now, because you want them to explore all these key features of medieval rural life, and at the same time you want to develop their evidential understanding. Now, what aspects of their evidential understanding do you think would be usefully explored through an inquiry on medieval village life?
How useful what would he's how useful is this for telling us about people in medieval times? Utility.
So utility of sources.
And the kind of the inferences from that, you know what I mean, the kind of what can we tell? I mean, I suppose it's related to utility, but how can we use these things to build up a picture? And then also the tension there with, and the picture isn't complete.
No.
Yes.
And how. And how that's an issue, and that maybe we'll have to tell them that it's not going to be complete.
That'll draw out their misconceptions. Well, let's look at, all of them will say, let's look in a newspaper from a time. Well, okay, are we going to be able to find one? It's just getting them to understand what is available, what can we use, what can't we use. All of them think you can just look at every single thing up on the internet.
And that's, outdoors would be brilliant for GCSE as well. I mean, I think that some of the true meaning behind questions at GCSE, the kind of idea of omissions, knowing what's left out. Well, this is what's left out with a purpose. You know what I mean? I think that's the good thing about it.
Yes. So you're going to be using these sources to help pupils generate good questions about medieval society, about the lives of peasants. Okay, if we've got these two dimensions at the moment kind of running in parallel in this inquiry, we've got the features, the diversity of life in a medieval village, and the development of pupils' evidential understanding. We need to kind of jump one way or the other in terms of framing an inquiry question, perhaps, unless we can come up with one that encompasses both. That doesn't mean to say that, and we'll drop one, we'll still bring it in, but at the forefront of this inquiry, are we going to have an evidential focus, because that will lead us into certain types of inquiry questions, or is it going to be more of a kind of features of a period? Because at the moment you've got an evidentially focused question, haven't you, that Esther thought was rather complicated and unfriendly for 11-year-olds. Why is it difficult to find out what it was like to live in a medieval village? If you move to the end product and ask a question like, what makes a realistic role play?
Yeah.
So you're really kind of rooting them back into the knowledge, because that's where it's going in the end, isn't it? When you get them to reflect on the role play.
Yeah.
So how can we make a realistic role play?
And I don't know. I always get stuck on words, but I think realistic. What's to say something is realistic or not? And for them, so could you just take it really back down to basics and say what makes a good role play, medieval role play, or how can we make a good role play?
How can we make a good medieval role play? Yeah, because in a way that mirrors what you're going to do with the historical fiction, doesn't it? Because
how can we write a good
story? How can
we
write a good story on the Black Death? Yeah.
And is that okay? I mean, I think it is. I mean, because in a way, I mean, because that was one of the things we did with the Roman. We'd had a Roman army essay, you know, kind of why were the Roman army so successful, and then we had another, why did William win the Battle of Hastings, and we wanted to make that connection so that in the hope that, you know, whereas we would perhaps structure the Roman one more for them, and then less structure for the why did William win, to kind of for them to apply that knowledge of cause type thing. So in the same way, I think that would be useful for us, I guess. Because
the question, what makes a good one, I think really addresses the issue that you raised at the beginning, which is through this vehicle, through this end product of a manorial court role play, you want the pupils to bring lots of historical knowledge into that about all these kinds of things we've listed. So to ask the question, what makes a good one, to do it and then reflect on it, to get the kids thinking about where the gaps in their knowledge are, which aspects of medieval life have they been able to get across in their own. I think that would be splendid.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, great. Okay, it takes the eye off the evidential focus that you had initially, but in a way I think that might be helpful to kind of almost play down that. We're going to be using various historical sources throughout. We can develop their evidential understanding throughout, but that isn't our big issue. And it follows the natural inclination of pupils, I think. Sometimes it is really useful to have an inquiry question focused on the product. If the product is a really interesting one that captures the kids' imagination, they will really love to produce this role play, and to keep them focused on it throughout. And the fact that it has to be a really good one, I think, can be a real driving force of all these lessons. I think that's a winner, really.